Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm very honoured to be asked to talk to the County Louth Archaeological Journal. My dad was a member when I was young, and we used to go to St. Vincent's to hear various historians, people interested in history talk. My father every week would take us, the four of us, to see something in Louth of historical interest. As I've said, I think I've seen every suitery in County Louth. At the time, we complained a lot, but it obviously sparked an interest in me because history is the love of my life. I'm going to talk to you today about Bertram de Verdon. Now, of course, anyone who's interested in Dundalk and Louth would know about Bertram and St Leonard's Priory and Hospital and the Fratres Cruciferi. So, to begin, when Prince John landed in Waterford on April 25th, 1185, among his close companions was a knight and royal administrator named Bertram de Verdon. Over the next 4 years, Bertram would play a crucial role in the founding of the town of Dundalk, and his descendants would continue to play an essential part in the development of the town, um, establishing medieval monuments that remain in the landscape to this day. These included monastic settlements within the town and, of course, Roach Castle, the next slide, which still overlooks the landscape on the Louth Armagh border. The de Verdon role within the town was at times altruistic, the Leonard Hospital in Seatown, and at times assertive, Roach Castle, which we can see here, which was intended to reinforce the de Verdon's overlordship of the entire area. The following passage from Dalton and O'Flanagan tells us a little bit about the background of Bertram de Verdon, the first member of the family to arrive in Louth. In a distant country of England, a Norman family was springing into power and fame that was destined soon materially to influence the future fortunes of Dundalk. Of that illustrious race, Bertram de Verdon, having been settled by the Conqueror in Leicestershire, was succeeded by his son Norman de Verdon, who, intermarrying with the daughter of Geoffrey de Clinton, who actually founded Kenilworth Castle, had issued by her a son, Bertram de Verdon. The name de Verdon, if we can move to the next slide, comes from a village in Normandy, which was located close to Vassy, itself close to the Norman border of Brittany. Bertram de Verdon first, so this would be the Bertram that came to Dundalk, was the third. Bertram the first settled in Leicester after he accompanied William the Conqueror to England in 1066. The presence of the de Verdon family in England in the aftermath of the conquest is actually confirmed by an entry in the Domesday Book, which noted that de Verdon held the manor of Farnham Royal in Buckinghamshire. It was Bertram the first descendant, Bertram de Verdon III, who would play a significant role in the establishment of the town of Dundalk in the late 12th century. Bertram de Verdon III was the eldest of three sons of Norman de Verdon and Luceline, the daughter of Geoffrey de Clinton, as I mentioned, and Bertram was probably born sometime in the 1140s. He had supported Henry II against his rebellious sons, and he was regularly present as a baron of the king's court. He also served as an itinerant justice in 8 counties and was the sheriff of Warwickshire and Leicestershire from 1163 to 1183. Bertram III wasn't just an administrator, a judge, and a diplomat, but he was also a warrior knight who, as I mentioned, supported Henry II against his sons in 1173, and it also sent supplies to Henry II from his estates when the king came to Ireland on his expedition between 1171 and 72. In the summer of 1185, Bertram accompanied Prince John to Ireland, probably at the behest of Henry II. Charters have survived, which record that Bertram progressed with John from Waterford to Kildare and then to Dublin. Now, it's interesting to note that most of these charters refer to Bertram as Seneschal. The seneschal was the steward and the most senior official in the administration of the monarchy's Irish territories. Prince John had appointed Bertram as Seneschal of Ireland and also as custodian of the castle of Drogheda, both important positions in the new colony's administration, and also a reflection of the esteem that Bertram was held in by Henry II and Prince John. The calendar of documents relating to Ireland for the years 1185-86 confirm Bertram's arrival in Ireland. Bertram de Verdon renders his account for the passage to Ireland of 9 ships of men, of John the King's son and their harness, hire of a ship to carry the supplies of Gilbert Pippard from Lancaster to that country, and for a ship to convey the supply of Bertram de Verdon to Ireland. Now, Bertram de Verdon and Gilbert Pippard were both granted extensive endowments covering much of modern-day County Louth. Henry II knew that he could rely on both these men to run his colony in his absence, and although they were men of military experience, de Verdon and Pippard were first and foremost royal servants, as opposed to great landowners. The type of expertise that both men possessed was appropriate to Louth, which was a relatively stable region that had posed no major military threat to the English since their arrival, at least not yet. The lands granted in Louth to Bertram were extensive. Sir James Ware details the grant as follows. About the close of the reign of Henry II to his son John, the so-called Lord of Ireland and Earl of Morton granted to Bertram de Verdon, Seneschal of Ireland, who afterward died in Palestine in the year 1192, 4 cantons of land in Uriel, half a canton in Louvain, being part of it which lies near the sea, to hold for the service of 20 knights. The Anglo-Norman name Oriel or Uriel was confined to the present county of Louth, but in former times, it was part of Ulster called Argelia, which you can see there on the slide. From the 6th century, it was one of the 3 major kingdoms of Ulster. The area that Bertram was endowed covered most of North Louth, including the Cooley Peninsula, and it corresponds roughly with the present-day Upper and Lower Barons of Dundalk. The grant also included the eastern part of the barony of Louth, as well as land stretching right into County Armagh, though no attempt seems to have been made to occupy these lands by Bertram. He was contented with drawing rents from the Irish kings. Ware also mentions Bertram's death in Palestine, and this refers to his decision to leave Ireland barely 4 years after he'd arrived in order to join the Third Crusade. It may also explain his devotion to St. Leonard, and we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail. But initially, Bertram chose Castletown, as the site for his chief manor in North Louth, and by the time de Verdon left Louth for the Crusade in 1190, his frontier castle, or the motte that we now have at Castletown, became associated with a church, a borough, and all of which stood within a newly formed parish. Almost certainly built by Bertram III, the remains of a Motte and Bailey castle can be seen at Castletown in Dundalk. And if we move on now, we can see that particular mound. Now, I love telling people when they talk about going to visit Cuchulain's Castle, which I used to do myself when I was younger, referring to the building on top of it, which of course was actually a folly built by the pirate Paddy Byrne. But you can see the size of the motte in these photos. The fact that the site controlled a wide landscape, including the ford over Castletown River at Tubarona, and was the main route into Ulster via the Moira Pass, was probably the reason Bertram chose to establish his kaput here. The motte itself consists of a massive circular mound, about 68 metres in diameter, at the base, about 45 metres across the top, and it stands between 8 and 10 metres from the bottom of a broad U-shaped fosse. The motte is mentioned as the castle of Dundalk in the marriage settlement between Bertram's daughter Lessalina and Hugh de Lacy. It states, agreement made between Thomas de Verdon and Hugh de Lacy. Thomas was given to Hugh de Lacy with Lessalina de Verdon, his sister, in frank marriage, the moiety of his land of Ireland. Thomas is given to Hugh 2.5 nights' fees in a suitable place in exchange for a like number retained to Grantor and his heirs around the castle of Dundalk. Okay, and that was referring to Cullen's Mosh, oh sorry, Castletown Mosh. Now, just how large that settlement at Castletown was remains unclear. Medieval sources refer to it as the Villa de Castletown, yet, as Bradley points out, um, historians are generally in agreement that the term ville or villa was used very loosely in the medieval period. Regardless of the size of the settlement of Castletown, the establishment of the new town of Dundalk and Seatown sometime in the early 13th century would soon overshadow it. And if you can see on the map here, we have Dundalk Bay, and then Castletown was about 2 miles to the west of it. The new medieval town of Dundalk was erected 2 kilometres east of Castletown, and the main factor influencing that move was probably the fact that although Castletown overlooked the river Ford at Tuberona, the river was actually very shallow and it wouldn't have been able to accommodate sea vessels. And trading along the Irish coast had really taken off, become very important in the 12th century. Relocating the settlement further downstream to an area around Seatown allowed for the development of a port capable of accommodating shipping. Seatown is situated on a low east-west gravel ridge, and although St Leonard's held extensive lands in and around the area, the actual built-up area of Seatown was small, and it probably only covered something around 10 acres. Slide. So again, we are just looking here at an old map of Louth, um, and you can see again the Dundalk Harbour, and it would have gone right up towards Seatown. Um, the area of Seatown included areas on two different sides, stretching from its junction, which anyone from the town would be familiar with, at Chapel Street to the west end of Mill Street. Many writers on the history of Dundalk argue for an early 13th century date for the town's foundation. But the earliest reference to the new town is from 1279-1280, when Nicholas de Verdon's widow, Basilia, claimed dower in the new and old villa of Dundalk at the Court of Common Pleas at Dublin. Gosling argues that the presence of a emerging new town was as early, could at least be as early as 1226, because there was a license granted then to have a annual fair at the manor of Dundalk to Nicholas de Verdon. The search for a date for the founding of the new town of Dundalk leads us on to the founding of the hospital and priory of St Leonard's in Seatown. Dalton and O'Flanagan state that Bertram de Verdon founded a friary here, Dundalk, for the crossbearers, following the rule of St Augustine, which he dedicated to St Leonard's. It was afterwards a hospital for both sexes and admitted the sick, the aged, and the infirm, and supplied the place of poorhouse and infirmary without the modern appliances of rates and taxes. Lucky men, lucky women. Sir James Ware confirms the establishment of St Leonard's when he wrote, "The Priory or Hospital of the Cruciferers or Crouch Friars, founded under the rule of St Augustine." In 1654, Ware argued that St Leonard's was founded during the reign of King John, between 1199 and 1216. Gwynn and Haddock support the idea of a pre-1216 date, stating that of the 16 houses of this order founded in Ireland 14, including Dundalk, were most likely established sometime between 1188 and 1216. The houses in Ireland were of Augustinian hospitallers from the very beginning, and at least 3 of their houses in Dublin, Ardee, and Dundalk had sisters as well as brethren. Now, the argument here is not that the new town of Dundalk was founded as early as 1188, merely that the priory of St Leonard predated the new town. As Gosling puts it, the fact that he, Bertram, chose to locate the new Friary Hospital not at Castletown but 2 kilometres to the southeast in a low-lying coastal plain suggests that he was presaging the development of the new town itself. It's not only the exact date of the founding of St Leonard's that remains obscure. The origins of the Fratres Cruciferi, who would administer the priory, are also ambiguous. There are claims that these brethren emerged from the earliest times of Christianity in the East, and their work included the founding of a hospital monastery in Jerusalem. In the Laird Archaeological Journal in 1907, Lawrence Murray wrote a paper which examined the founding of this order in more depth. Towards the end of the 12th century, the Saracens had conquered large areas of southeast Europe, capturing Christians and forcing them into slavery. And as a result, two holy men, John of Matha and Felix of Valois, founded an order under the patronage of the Most Holy Trinity, which would function by the same rules as the regular canons of St. Augustine. Originally, the main aim of this order was to collect alms for the ransom of slaves, but over time their vocation extended to serving the sick, the poor, and the afflicted, and it was in this role that they exercised a holy calling to Ireland. By the 12th century, the order had become known as croziers or cross-bearers because of the robe which incorporated a cross. In fact, their habit actually consisted of a long white robe with a red and blue cross embroidered on the breast, as we can see here. After their introduction into England as sister houses of the Flemish Fratres Cruciferi, they became known as Crutch Friars. And we'll talk a little bit more about this order further on in the talk. Another problem is there's an absence of information surrounding St Leonard himself. Now, it appears he was born in the 5th century to a noble Frankish family, and that he entered a monastery at Missy near Orleans, and later, on a grant of land by King Clovis, he founded a monastery at Nobelique near Limoges. By the 11th century, devotion to him was widespread across Europe, mainly because of the many favours attributed to his intercession, including the release of prisoners, and he was revered also as a patron saint for the safe deliverance, and as such was prayed to by many crusaders. In England, there were 174 churches and hospitals dedicated to St Leonard. And it's interesting to note that St Leonard was also revered for interceding on behalf of both man and beast afflicted with disease. This may explain why so many hospitals were named after him or devoted to him. In 2022, the Council of Oxford prescribed St Leonard's feast as a holy day. But the question remains why Bertram de Verdon was responsible for the only church run by the Fratres Cruciferi dedicated to St Leonard's in the new town of Dundalk. The church in the old town of Dundalk, Castletown, had been dedicated by Bertram de Verdon to St John the Baptist. This is confirmed by an early charter preserved in the Register of Documents of St John at Newgate in Dublin. And what it says is, to all Christ's faithful people that shall see or hear these letters, Bertram de Verdon greeting. Know the whole of you that for the sake of charity I have been granted, and by the present charter confirmed, to God and St John the Baptist Church of Dundalk, in thankful mind for the welfare of my soul and for the welfare of Dame Rosia, my wife, and all of my ancestors' titles, and all the ecclesiastical benefices of my whole land of Dundalk. So, like many others, Bertram was trying to save his soul by creating a church or founding a church. Um, this was common practice in the medieval period. I'm not saying there wasn't any altruistic altruism involved, but certainly a part of it was trying to save their souls. As I explained earlier, the new town of Dundalk may not have been established when the Fratres Cruciferi Hospitallers arrived in Louth. So to dedicate the monastery to the same saint as out in Castletown, John the Baptist, would only have created confusion. The reason for Bertram's devotion to St Leonard may have been concerned with the saint himself. Earlier in this lecture, it was stated that St. Leonard was known as the patron saint for safe deliverance. He was also the saint of captives and prisoners of war, and was revered by many of the Crusaders, as I said, who went to the Holy Land. And this consideration may have weighed heavily with Bertram in his choice of dedication. So this may be one of the reasons he chose St. Leonard, because he was going to go on crusade. There is another factor that lends weight to an early date for the establishment of St. Leonard. Bertram's devotion to the saint supports the argument that he that founded the priory in Seatown. We know that he left for the Third Crusade sometime towards the end of the 1180s. This crusade was proclaimed by Pope Gregory VIII following the defeat by Saladin of the field army of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem at the Battle of Hattin, and that was in 1187, and his subsequent capture of the Holy City itself. And after his coronation, the call to the crusade was taken up by Richard I. Bertram's decision to follow him may well have been a political move, both to demonstrate his loyalty to the crown and to secure his position at court. The crusade departed from Versailles in northern France in the spring of 1190. Now, we don't know the exact date Bertram left Ireland, but it must have been before this date. And in fact, contemporary documents state that he was present at the court of King Richard at Geddington on the 16th of September 1189. Thus, if it was Bertram who founded St. Leonard's, it's entirely possible it was founded sometime before 1189. Finally, as stated above, Bertram de Verdon was Sheriff of Warwickshire and Leicestershire from 1168 to 1183, and as I said, he served as an itinerant justice in 8 counties. As such, he would have been well travelled, and almost certainly familiar with Leicester Abbey, which had been founded in 1138 and was constructed within the open fields to the north of the medieval city of Leicester. Leicester Abbey was a very important medieval religious foundation, and after the initial distribution of land in the late 11th century, Leicester Abbey developed to the point that it actually held nearly 1/7 of the land of the whole county. And between Leicester Abbey and the city of Leicester, the Hospital and Church of St. Leonard was founded. Now we know St. Leonard's Hospital and Church St. Leonard's Hospital and Church in Leicester, not Leicester Abbey, but St. Leonard's Hospital, was founded in the late 12th century. According to Henry of Knighton, the founder of the Hospital of St. Leonard in Leicester was William the Leper, son of Robert de Brutal, the Earl of Leicester. In the medieval period, there was a need for somewhere for the lower aristocracy, suffering from long-time illnesses or even just old age, to reside and receive necessary care, and this may explain why William founded the hospital at Leicester. Neither St. Leonard's Hospital in Dundalk or Leicester can be assigned a definite date for foundation, but what can be said is this. They were both founded sometime in the late 12th century, and St. Leonard's Hospital in Priory in Dundalk was constructed, we think, by Bertram de Verdon, the Sheriff of Leicestershire. St. Leonard's Hospital and Church in Leicester were built in the most important town of that county. It would not be too far a leap to suggest that Bertram would actually have been familiar with St. Leonard's Hospital in Leicester, and that if it was constructed first, that Bertram was familiar with it. So this may also have been in his mind when he founded the hospital in Dundalk. Next slide. Bertram died at Jaffa in August 1192. We don't know whether from a battle wound or a disease. His possessions in Louth and elsewhere then passed to his son Thomas de Verdon, who died in 1199. And then his possessions were passed to his other son, Nicholas de Verdon, who obtained a royal charter and a license from King John in 2003 to enter these possessions. It actually said Warwick, Leicestershire. Nicholas de Verdon owes 100 marks, a war horse and a palfrey for having lands in Ireland, whereof Bertram, his father, was seized in his domain as a fee for his debt, for having custody during the king's pleasure of the lands which were acknowledged to belong to the primate of Armagh. That's a bit of a mouthful. So what are we talking about here? This refers to the patronage of the crown and the king's rights regarding the church, which meant during any vacancies in the Archbishopric of Armagh, he could give custody of its extensive lands to colonists like Bertram de Verdon. This wasn't always the case. In fact, a century later, when a vacancy arose again, the prior of St Leonard was chosen as the guardian of these lands. Although Bertram may have founded St Leonard in the late 12th century, we do know it was probably Nicholas, his son, who was responsible for the enlargement of the priory and hospital to meet the increasing demands for the hospitalisation of the sick, aged, and infirm. The priory of St Leonard, like all priories, would have depended on the benefices of the wealthy in order to continue the ministrations to the needy. There are references to this within the Dowdall deeds. We know that St Leonard gained in importance as both a hospital and a priory, because in 12th century, Patrick O'Scanlan, the Archbishop of Armagh, actually died at St Leonard's Priory. Patrick O'Scanlan, he died the 15th of March 1270 at St Leonard's Priory at Dundalk, a house of crouched friars of the Order of St Augustine, and was buried in the Dominican convent in Drogheda. Now, although there were other reasons for his choosing St Leonard's as his residence for his final days, including the fact that he actually may have come from Dundalk and that it was just down the road at the Grey Friary that he was consecrated as Bishop of Raphoe. It must be concluded that the primary reason he came to the hospital in Dundalk was for medical attention. Yeah, if we look at the slide here, we can see Seatown. So you have Jocelyn Street, and behind it we have Seatown. And if you look along, but if you look between Jocelyn Street and Seatown Place and see that road heading north, that's where the Grey Friary was on the right, and to the left is St Leonard's Priory. So they were very close to each other. Much of the information regarding St Leonard's development as a hospital and priory comes from written sources, like the Dowdall deeds or the calendar of documents relating to Ireland. But it's when we turn to the archaeology of the priory that we begin to encounter difficulties. Little is known of the exact location or the extent of buildings included in St Leonard's Priory. There have been some minor excavations which were a result of modern building works. For example, in 1911, during the construction of the electric light works, which later became the ESB office and yard, and just behind the Priory build, what's left now of Seatown Gardens, 10 stone-lined graves were uncovered. And the 1982 survey into the archaeology of Dundalk argues that these graves were part of the original graveyard at the monastery of St Leonard. In 1995, human remains were also discovered when a telecom Air crew was digging a trench for cables at the corner of Seatown and Chapel Street. The subsequent excavation was monitored by Kieran Campbell on behalf of the Louth County Museum, and it revealed the remains of 4 burials and a quantity of disarticulated bone. So there we have, that would have been the old library, which subsequent to that had been the old grammar school. And in the foreground, we see what came to be known as Seatown Graveyard, but which was originally the Priory of St Leonard's. Actually, something was noted in the report by Kieran was the development involved the conversion into apartments of an existing building, the former Viscount Limerick Grammar School, founded in 1725 and remodelled as the County Library in 1902. The building occupies part of the site of the Priory and Hospital of St Leonard. Burials have been discovered during redevelopment work in the area on a number of occasions since 1911, and then in 1991 and 1995. The latter excavations revealed a charnel pit of disarticulated bone, which was exposed at the west end where the trench widened. Again, this is a picture of the library where the priory, we believe, was situated. A dump of stone rubble with roof slate and small fragments of medieval ridge tile was also uncovered close to the charnel pit, and pottery shards from the 13th, 14th century dates were found within one of the burial sites. All the deposits continued north under the garden. Tradition has it that the site of St Leonard's Priory lays beneath the old technical school and the county library, so it's an area around the back and the side of St Leonard's Gardens that we have now. I'll explain that a wee bit more in a minute. Although St Leonard's was occupied until its suppression in 1540, we've no information at all regarding its original layout, its scale, or even its architecture. What we do have is a list of the Priory's possessions at its dissolution. Patrick Galtram, the last prior of St Leonard's, listed the building of the Priory, including a church, a chapter house, a dormitory, a hall, and other buildings, as well as some 250 acres of land and several dwelling houses and the tithes of the rectories of Dundalk and Haggard. We can presume that many of these buildings must have been destroyed in the immediate aftermath of the Priory's dissolution, because the following was recorded soon after. No superfluous buildings here, but there now remains the house of the aforesaid hospital, which is well and sufficiently repaired and well victualled for the defence of the town of Dundalk and suitable for the necessary use of farmers. And the said circuit and precinct of the same hospital contains, by estimation, 2 acres. So that was the immediate priory itself. Now, what can be a bit confusing here is the site has been referred to by me and others as the Leonard Priory and Hospital. But in the 17th century, it became known as Seatown Graveyard. And then from the 1960s, it became St Leonard's Garden. Unfortunately, only fragment remains of the original priory in the north boundary of St Leonard Garden in Seatown, which consists of a pointed undercroft. This is rectangular in plan and opens at the west end and was probably part of a vaulted 2-storey building, with probably a domestic building. Curran, writing in the County Louth Archaeological Journal in 1971, tells us a portion of what may have been the burial ground of the monastery was used as a public graveyard until it was closed and walled up in 1896. So we have a few photographs here of sort of the it had become quite, how could you put it, disturbed. There was a lot of weeds and stuff around it. There's another one here as well to show you. Oh, and this was the wall along it. So it was used as a burial ground and, a public graveyard until it was closed and walled up in 1896. Left derelict, it became overgrown with briars and saplings and weeds until the 1960s, when the Old Dundalk Society, with the permission of local authorities, cleared the site, plotted and recorded the gravestones which they placed around the remaining walls, sowed grass, and with the assistance of the local garden society, actually. I love this picture. The man chap here is holding a seed fiddle, and we actually have that in the museum. The one he's holding. It spread out the seeds in a sort of wide arc. You pulled it almost like a fiddle. So anyhow, with the assistance of the Old Dundalk Society and the local garden society, there was roses and shrubs planted, converting the neglected and forgotten graveyard into a garden of remembrance, and they decided to name it St Leonard's Garden. And here's a lovely picture. That girl in the front has a bowl haircut like I had when I'm probably around the same age as her. And when I first saw it, I thought, is that me? Because I had the exact same haircut. But we can see here, my father was born in Seatown, and certainly St Leonard's Garden was somewhere that a lot of the kids would go to. It was a lovely spot. It's even nicer now. There are a number of gravestones remaining in St Leonard's, and we can see them along the wall here. For example, we have Patrick Connolly, who was buried in 1839. There's a George Taff, who was buried in 1859. And of course, we have the men who died attempting to rescue the ship, the Mary Stoddard. In 1858, there was a terrible storm in Dundalk Bay, and there was a number of ships got into difficulty. And there was a number of rescue attempts, and 4 particular sailors actually drowned in their attempt to save the crew of the Mary Stoddard. And their names were Captain James, Joseph Kelly, Jared Hughes, James Crosby, and James Murphy. And they were all buried in Seatown graveyard. And I just wanted to show you some of the gravestones that were uncovered when, or were rescued when they started creating St Leonard's Garden. A short series of excavation in Seatown in the 1990s, which I already mentioned, were a response to the discovery of workmen by a number of skeletal remains during the refurbishment of some outbuildings at the back of the house at number 5 Seatown, Dundalk. The 1991 archaeological excavation was carried out by Owen Halpin, and the excavation report tells us the site obviously suffered in the dissolution, but the church continued in use until the 19th century, and the nearby burial ground was in use up to 1876. It was clear from the excavations that the plot lay within the graveyard, presumably associated with the Priory and Hospital of St Leonard. Evidence from the cuttings showed that the graveyard was well ordered, with the bodies buried in rows, all of them orientated, and none apparently disturbing a previous burial. This strongly suggests that there were some sort of surface grave markers, at least in this area of the graveyard. The evidence also showed that both adults and juveniles were being buried, and is likely, although there was no direct evidence uncovered, that both males and females were represented. There was also no direct evidence for dating, but the discovery of the possible remains of a coffin associated with one of the skeletons does suggest that this particular example was very old. It is also noteworthy that the skeleton was the only example where positive evidence survived to have its arm folded across its chest. The other examples all had their hands crossed over their pelvis. Just examples here. Finally, what emerged from this project is that any digging in the area of number 5 Seatown will in all probability produce more skeletal remains and possibly some structural evidence associated with the adjacent Priory and Hospital of St Leonard. If we return to the excavation in 1995, it was concentrated, as I said earlier, on the footpath just up, if you were heading round by what used to be the old library, where it turns into Chapel Street. And it consisted of a 7-metre cable trench, about 10.7 metres from the modern entrance into St Leonard's Gardens. There was a footpath about 0.2 metres thick, and it was removed. And disarticulated human bones were found in the soil under the footpath, along with the 4 in situ burials. There was a lot of bones, including skulls and a pelvis, which were also uncovered. The position of these remains also allows us to infer something regarding the setting of the priory. It is juxtaposed with the boundary wall of Seatown Graveyard behind the old Dundalk Library building, which together with the VEC school at one stage formed an imposing block of corporation buildings in the very centre of Dundalk town. Surrounding the priory are a number of streets that are accessed from the principal thoroughfare through Dundalk. So surrounding what's now St Leonard's Garden are a number of streets, all accessed from Cabrassa Street. If we take into account the priory was situated almost exactly at the town centre in the medieval period, and the fact that a large number of streets could have surrounded it, we can actually infer that the town might have developed around St Leonard's. The priory is also situated a short walk from the harbour of Dundalk, and Gosling argues that St Leonard's was deliberately chosen by the de Verdons to secure the Castletown River estuary. And he also argues that it may have acted as a focus for settlement as trade began to develop in the estuary. This argument is supported by the fact that from its foundation, the town of Dundalk was restricted to the northern end of the natural ridge on which it was built, close to the river. It is interesting to note that the town only began to spread outwards after the dissolution of St Leonard's. The Priory may indeed have acted as an anchor, playing an indispensable role in aiding the townsfolk, who may have wished to remain contained within the area surrounding the Priory. This isn't purely guesswork. St Leonard's was certainly part of the earliest settlement of Dundalk, but long before the first documented reference to the new town of Dundalk by Bertram de Verdon in 1279. One problem when trying to determine the layout of St Leonard's concerns the remains of the 15 other cross-bearer foundations within Ireland. There just is not sufficient enough remains to allow us to determine whether there was any recurrent layout in the houses of this order. A number of churches did have towers, but there's no reference to any tower in the 1540 survey completed after Priory's dissolution. Now, I did mention the word defensive in the 1540 survey. Remains the house of the aforesaid hospital, which is well and sufficiently repaired and well victualled for the defence of the town of Dundalk. This statement hints that the architecture of the Priory may have incorporated some form of defensive feature. However, although the town's defences are mentioned first in the sources of the 14th century, there are no references to any defensive features within St Leonard's in any sources pre-1540. Gwyn and Hadcock inform us that both sisters as well as brethren resided at St Leonard's. This, together with the fact that the hospital would have admitted both male and female patients, must have meant there was separate accommodation for both the community as well as the hospital patients. The de Verdon association with St Leonard's continued throughout the medieval period. In 1287, Theobald de Verdon, in accordance with family tradition, made a grant to Prior Osygod of certain benefices and lands for a yearly rent of 17.5 marks. It can be argued that the role of the order of the Fratres Cruciferi in St Leonard's Priory Dundalk was much more than purely spiritual, concerned only with their communal affair, as it's from its earliest foundation, the brethren of the order were closely associated, as I've mentioned a few times, with the care of the sick and public ministry, and were in receipt of several benefices. In fact, by the mid-15th century, about one-third of the benefices of County Louth were held by priests who had been attached to the Cruciferi. Until its dissolution, the Priory played an essential role within the life of the town of Dundalk, and it stood as a testament to the de Verdons. Bertram may have founded the abbey sometime before leaving Ireland in 1189. As argued above, he may have been familiar with St Leonard's Hospital in Leicester. It is impossible to carry out any archaeological comparison because there are no remains of St Leonard's in Leicester. Gosling argues that Seatown graveyard, which is the present St Leonard's Garden, probably dates from the 17th century. In 1911, the graves discovered were lintel graves. These would be from some sort of early Christian burial. The grave is lined with slabs and covered with slabs or lintels. Possibly this was from an early Christian period. As I said, there's not been enough archaeological excavation done to give us as much information as we like. The 1952 and 1995, when graves or burials were uncovered, appear to be medieval. That's as much as we can say. So finally, we're going to have an overview of the Fratres Cruciferi in Ireland. Now, we all know the monastic orders of the medieval period are almost as well known as its most famous figures. Any individual who studies this area will be as familiar with the Cluniacs, the Cistercians, the Franciscans and Dominicans as they are with William the Conqueror, Henry II, Roger of Sicily and Llewellyn ap Yarret. These orders were the lifeblood of the Middle Ages, its moral conscience, so to speak, and played a vital role, not just in administrating to the souls of the wealthy, but providing the poor with alms, charity, caring for the infirm. However, while some of these orders are very well known, others remain obscure. It can prove very difficult to define or detail a particular order because little is known regarding its development or because it differs from one geographical region to another. One such group is the Fratres Cruciferi. This order was established before the better known friars such as the Dominicans and Franciscans and stayed in existence long after 1274 when groups like the Friars of the Sack or the Pied Friars were dissolved. Now, they were dissolved because there was a Lateran council in the 13th century and decided there was too great a number of mendicant or begging friars, and that's why some of them were dissolved, but not the Fratres Cruciferi. So we're going to try and disentangle the mystery surrounding this group by having a short look at how it developed. By the 13th century, there were at least four families of the Cruciferi, all following the rule of St. Augustine, but otherwise unconnected with each other. The Augustinian rule had originated during the 11th century, when a group of canons became dissatisfied with the Aiken rule, which permitted canons to own their own private property. They turned to a document called the Rule of St. Augustine, which had been devised by Augustine of Hippo, and his rule was compiled of a series of texts which had been circulated in an abridged form. In the 11th century, Reforming canons began following this rule, which called for obedience, communal mass, abstinence, simplicity in dress, and the renunciation of personal property. By the 12th century, the Fratres Cruciferi were all regular canons under the rule of St. Augustine, and this involved a quasi monastic community life without the rigours of strict monastic discipline. We know that in the medieval period there were a number of different orders, congregations, or branches, all calling themselves Cruciferi, although some of them were called croziers, some crutched friars, some cross bearers. How the word friar became attached to the word cruciferi or crutched is not known, and in fact, during the 13th century, members of the order, both in England and on the continent, most often referred to themselves as Frates Sancti Crucis, the Brethren of the Holy Cross. Although they were not mendicants, in that they accepted the need for owning corporate property that they could live in, they were like the friars in that they followed the Vita Apostolica, which was a religious life based on the model of the apostles, devoted to serving the world around them. All friars developed as a protest against the whole idea of a totally monastic life, which attempted to seclude men and women from society. A monastery was actually a self contained community with no interest or responsibility for anything going on outside the walls of the monastery. On the other hand, friars lived entirely among their fellow men, while the Fratres Cruciferi lived in priories that included hospitals. Priories became a very important role, or played a very important role in the life of a medieval town, with their churches and precincts becoming major landmarks. And the Cruciferi themselves fulfilled many of the roles now performed by modern social services by looking after the poor and the homeless. One of the groups of Fratres Cruciferis was referred to as the Italian congregation. They were first established in the Holy Land. Hadcock informs us that according to the Chronicle of Her Schiedel, Pope Innocent IV at Leeds in 2045 gave additional rules and ordained that the brethren should always carry a cross in hand, which is one of the reasons they were called crutch friars. The first priory founded by the Fratres Cruciferi in Ireland was the Hospital of St John the Baptist in Dublin. It was founded by Alred the Palmer and was confirmed by Clement III in November 1188. It was known as Palmer's Hospital. The foundation date of this hospital points to the Italian branch of the Fratres Cruciferi here in Ireland. The Italian congregation was first referred to in contemporary sources in 1159. Hadcock argues that the character of the Irish houses seemed to prove that they were modelled from the monastery hospitals of the Italian congregation. It is almost certain that the other houses of this order throughout Ireland sprang from the same foundation. The limited number of excavation and written documents regarding this order prevents us from asserting uniform architectural features throughout the priories in Ireland. However, the excavation of the Priory of St John the Baptist in Rindoon allows us to give a clearer picture of how one of these foundations might have appeared. Rindoon is situated in the peninsula of St John's Point on the shore of Lough Ree. It was founded for the Cruciferi by King John in and around 1216, although there are very few references to it prior to 1596. In that year, it was described as being roofed with shingles and that it included a cloister and three decaying buildings. Its present remains have been detailed by the Heritage Council regarding the archaeology of Indoon, which is actually a whole deserted medieval village. Only the church survives, and this is a rectangular of the Priory of St John the Baptist, and this is a rectangular structure with an unusual buttress addition at the north end. In the 11th century, a number of alterations were made, specifically to the windows, although some of the original jambs survive. There are undulations in the surface of the graveyard to the east of the church, which might indicate the outline of some type of structure, but no recognisable patterns have been determined. But also within the graveyard, there are 8 architectural fragments, and the finest of which is a multi-moulded base for a cloister column. There is another Catholic graveyard beside it, and here a further number of fragments were discovered, including another cloister column, fragments of tracery, the head of a single light oogie head window, and the head of a 2-light window, all of which were constructed of limestone. Rindoon provides us possibly with some information regarding the layout of the priories of the Fratres Cruciferi. One very interesting find were the remnants of cloister columns. Specialists in ecclesiastical architecture lament the paucity of information available on canonical cloisters. This is especially true of the Cruciferi. However, it is fair to assume that if the foundation in Rindoon included a cloister, that may be the case for all the foundations of the Fratres Cruciferi established in Ireland. A cloister is an architectural term which refers to an enclosed courtyard formed by the walls of a church and its residential buildings, and ringed by a covered colonnade which overlooks the central quadrangle. This architectural feature was a very important element, certainly, of monastic life. And if we look here, what we have here at the top, we have Sligo Abbey. Then we actually have here Glastonbury Abbey. And the bottom one, which I think is beautiful, is at Muckross. There was an essential difference between the cloister of the monastic orders, like the Cistercian, and that of the canons and friars, including the Cruciferi. Because of their devotion to offering hospitality and charity in local society, canons had permission to leave the cloister, unlike the monks. As discussed at the beginning of this lecture, in 1654, Sir James Ware argued that St Leonard's was founded during the reign of King John, from 1199 to 1216. Dolan suggests an earlier date of 1160, which is too early for a priory of the Cruciferi, but Gwynn and Hadcock argue that it is possible that a hospital of St Leonard had already been founded here and was granted to the Cruciferi by Bertram de Verdon sometime in 1189. As I've said, it's not only an exact date for the founding of St Leonard's which has proved problematic. It is also impossible to state the exact location or extent of the buildings included in St Leonard's Priory. A number of minor excavations have done little to add to knowledge regarding the actual archaeology of the Priory. In conclusion, this lecture is attempted to provide some background information regarding the Fratres Cruciferi in Ireland, Bertram de Verdon, and St Leonard's. It's now known as St Leonard's Garden, but which was St Leonard's Priory and Hospital. As mentioned, it can be very difficult to identify in detail a particular order. And as I said, it's due to different factors. We don't know that much about how the order developed, and they can differ from one region to another. Because the Cruciferi is such an order, detailing its development is further confused due to a lack of archaeological information, together with a scarcity of documentation. What we can state with certainty is that St Leonard's Prior and Hospital made a major contribution to the development of the town of Dundalk. In 2007, the site was turned into a really lovely urban green space with the development of a sensory garden under or commissioned by Dundalk Urban District Council. We may know little about how it looked in its heyday, but we can say, and anyone in Seatown will agree, or anyone in Dundalk will agree, St Leonard's Garden continues to support the people of Dundalk, giving us a space to reflect, surrounded by the history and burial places of some of the earliest residents of the town. Thank you.